Hello and welcome to the Personnel Today HR podcast, brought to you by Deal. Hire, manage and pay anyone, anywhere. I'm Rob Moss, editor of Personnel Today, and I'm joined by our regular contributing editors Joe Faragher and Adam McCulloch, and our resident legal expert Darren Newman. Welcome everyone.
Hello.
Hey Rob, thanks for having us.
Each month we look at some of the most significant stories of the past few weeks and examine the implications for HR practitioners and employers. In this month's episode, we have an exclusive interview with Mariella Giancola, Head of HR at the British Antarctic Survey, who will be sharing with us some of the challenges of recruiting and managing people at its research base in Antarctica. We'll be looking at the most significant changes to employment law coming in April, including day one statutory sick pay, day one paternity leave, trade union recognition, and the establishment of the Fair Work Agency. And we'll be looking at the rise of tribunal claims relating to neurodivergent conditions and what HR can be doing to try to raise awareness and manage these sorts of issues. But before that, a message from our friends at Deal, sponsors of the Personnel Today HR podcast. Deal is the all-in-one people platform for modern HR teams. Bring hiring, onboarding, payroll, performance, offboarding, and more into one global system so you can focus on people, not paperwork. Serving over 150 countries, Deal simplifies compliance and helps HR teams move faster. To see what hiring without borders looks like, visit deel.com/personnel to book your demo. That's deel.com/personnel. Okay, Joe, let's start with you. You've been talking to Mariella Giancola at the British Antarctic Survey. Tell us more.
Yes, I had a real pleasure of speaking to Mariella this month. Unfortunately, I didn't get to go out to the South Pole, but I did have a Zoom interview with her in Cambridge. And I'm sure everyone knows, but BAS is the UK's National Polar Research Institute, and there's 5 research stations in Antarctica, and they also look after the polar research ship, the RSS Sir David Attenborough, which many of you will know as Boaty McBoatface. It was really interesting because as an HR person, she's not just supporting scientists. It's like running a tiny village in one of the most remote places on Earth.
Technically, we have a wide range of professions. We have not just, we recruit every year for chefs, plumbers, carpenters, plant operators, mechanics, electricians, boat handlers, meteorological observers, diving officers. We have a management team on site. We have a doctor on site. We have mental health trained champions on site. So we have spent a lot of time to build a supportive, a safe, not just physically, psychologically safe environment. So my responsibility is to ensure that no one affects that. So if there is someone who really is careless, someone who doesn't respect the rules and doesn't respect others, then we are unlikely to keep those people. We will take people off station. We know hesitations if they are affecting the dynamics in the team or they are presenting a risk.
And it was really interesting to speak to her about how they recruit people for these roles, because it wasn't what I expected. So I asked her about what the sorts of qualities that they look for and how they prepare people.
Yes, so we don't run psychometric tests because really you cannot reproduce the conditions or the stress people will go under. So you might get a view or a perception of someone, but then when they are on site, they might react in a very completely different way. So we look for people who are approachable, who can adjust easily, people who are gregarious, and they have experience of spending time or working, operating in community setting. It doesn't mean that if you are a reserved person, if you are a quiet person, you will not get on well with people. Some people, if you are adaptable and you get to the point where you understand that you need to engage with people, then some people just, it takes some time, but they get on well with everyone else.
Yeah, it's about self-awareness, isn't it? As much as
It's
anything.
definitely about self-awareness. It's also about it's honesty, because we get a lot of people in interviews say, "Oh, don't worry, I don't have a problem," and then if they are rooted in their own habits, and they might find it hard to adjust. It's working on a station or on the ship requires a degree of adaptability that not everyone might be comfortable with, and therefore talking to people who have spent time on station or are coming back or spend time on the ship is a great opportunity for people to get a real account of what happened, because describing what might be like or hearing it from an HR professional or a safety professional might not provide the same level of understanding. But we invest a lot of time for people who are deployed to spend time with their teams in Cambridge. So they come on contract normally 3 months before they deploy in October, so that they can familiarize with the team. Because when they are south, we refer to being in Antarctica south, when they're south and they pick up the phone or they contact someone, it's not a stranger for them. Those are people they have familiarized with. In many cases, their line manager they will have a project manager on site, but their line manager will be in Cambridge. So we try and make sure that they become familiar with the people they engage with, and we also run training sessions, building sessions. Everyone goes through training or awareness sessions to talk about respectful relationship, to talk about inclusive communication, inclusive language, and we do have refresher sessions for people after they've spent 3 months. So we do whatever we can to make clear that we will support you, and we can. We appreciate that it might take some time, and initially you might feel a bit overwhelmed because it's something that you can't explain. However, we do expect you to treat people with respect, and we expect you to apply a common sense approach. If I had to find a scale for everyone going south, is use your common sense, because you are responsible for your safety and the safety of the people around you.
A really fascinating thing that we focused about was the sorts of challenges they would face in the conditions, which when it's like a tiny village and everybody knows everybody and everybody's bumping into anybody. I asked about some of the social dynamics challenges, and this is what she said.
So there are the challenges of ensuring that people who are deployed and work remotely still feel part of the organization, and that's the reason why we tend to be very visible. Senior management, members of the HR team, members of the safety team, we tend to visit people. We spend a lot of time with people before they deploy, so we can build that relationship, because I'm sure you appreciate that if the only interaction they had with HR is when something goes wrong, then it doesn't work like that. So we have every year in September, we have a massive pre-deployment conference. All the people who are going to deploy attend the conference. It's 2 weeks in Cambridge, and then there's additional training, team building exercise, and they spend time with us. They talk to returners, they share experience, so they build an understanding of what is going to feel like and what the challenges might be. And it's unusual, but we have had a couple of cases where people have decided that it wasn't for them. Because, I mean, you have this dream of the Antarctic adventure, but when you start talking to people, or when you attend training and you realize that actually there will be constraint to your freedom. You cannot wander wherever you want. At the moment, Rodera is a construction site because we are modernizing the station. So we have 60, 70 building workers working together with the bus staff. And those dynamics are interesting and challenging at the same time. There are restrictions on how much they can drink. We have an alcohol policy to keep everyone safe. There are constraints on what they can say. And I mean, if you are at home or if you work in an office and you have a disagreement with a colleague, then you go home, have time to reflect. The following morning, you might go back and say, oh, sorry. But on station, you don't have that. The people you work with are the people you socialize with. The same people are there at breakfast, lunchtime, during snack times, at the cinema or in the bar. And that's one of the biggest challenges I have, trying to manage a diverse community of people coming from a variety of occupational, socioeconomic, cultural backgrounds, who have to spend time with other people. Personal space, zero, because you share a room with people, you share a bathroom with other people. There are a lot of communal areas. You can't just say, I need time for myself, because it's very hard. And that's the biggest challenge, managing conflicts in those circumstances. Because in the office, it's easier to de-escalate things. But on the station or on the ship, wherever space is confined, and you end up spending a lot of time with people, sometimes, in your face. So it's a big challenge.
Mariella Giancola, Head of HR at the British Antarctic Survey, talking with Joe there. The Personnel Today HR podcast is brought to you by Deal. Hire, manage and pay anyone, anywhere. Right, next we're looking at some changes to employment law that are coming in a couple of weeks, as well as the usual gender pay gap reporting deadlines and an uplift to the national minimum wage and the national living wage. We've some new provisions from the Employment Rights Act. And Darren, we're going to do a whistle-stop tour of the main changes, starting with statutory sick pay.
Yeah, I mean, I this is the thing that's in my mind at the moment, because I don't know if you can tell, Rob, but I don't sound brilliant at the moment. No. I'm in the second day of a really heavy cold, so I'd like lots of sympathy. But it's interesting, I'm in my second day, and if I had a proper job for which I would sort of like phone in sick, under the current SSP system, if I was reliant on statutory sick pay, I wouldn't yet qualify for any sick pay, because this is only my second day of feeling unwell. And at the moment, under the regime, in order to qualify for statutory sick pay, you have to have a period of incapacity for work, which is at least 4 days long, and you need to have been absent, first of all, for 3 what we call waiting days before your 4th qualifying day is when statutory sick pay starts to be unpayable. That's all being abolished, and statutory sick pay becomes, in the phrase that the government likes to use, a day one right. It's something that you're entitled to from the first day of your incapacity for work. So if I was qualifying for SSP, and the new regime was in, I would be on my second day now if I phoned in sick.
Could you explain the other change on statutory sick pay around the lower earnings limit, which is going up to around £123 from the 6th of April?
Yes, but for statutory sick pay, we'll no longer need to worry about the lower earnings limit, because everyone will qualify for statutory sick pay, no matter how low their earnings are, although it'll be on a graded scale. It'll be, I think, 80% of their pay if they're earning lower than the lower earnings limit. So even if you're very low paid, you will get some statutory sick pay even for your first day of absence. The big issue with this, I've got a couple of issues with statutory sick pay. One, it is far too complicated a right. I mean, it's a ridiculous right to actually try and get your head round. And that's for historical reasons. It's evolved from a benefit, essentially, that was administered by employers. Originally, the Treasury would reimburse employers for the statutory sick pay they paid. They no longer do that, but the regulations still have all the mechanisms of calculating statutory sick pay that sort of assumes that it's a government expense. So it's much more complicated than it needs to be. The second problem I've got with it is, of course, statutory sick pay is incredibly low. So at the moment, it is, I think, £118 a week. And while that will get uprated, it's not going to fundamentally change as a result of this. So yes, if I was phoning in sick today under the new regime and I was entitled to statutory sick pay, I think I would get, if I worked 5 days a week, I'd get about £23 statutory sick pay. And if I was on minimum wage working a 40-hour week, I'd be earning £100 today. So there aren't going to be very many people who are in a position casually to take a day's sickness to throw one sickie, for example, if what that means is that their pay is going to be so incredibly low as a result. So I'm not convinced there's going to be a huge impact of this, but of course there will be employers for whom this is an important change.
Okay, moving on. Paternity leave, that's becoming a day one right, is that right?
Yep, that becomes a day one right, as does traditional parental leave. That was something that was flagged up very early on. Separately from the Employment Rights Act, we're also introducing bereaved partners parental leave, which allows somebody to take up to 52 weeks leave, but only where their partner, who's either the mother or the main carer for the child, has actually died within the first year since the child was born. So a very small number of people that will actually apply to. So yeah, those changes have been well flagged up. I don't think very many employers will struggle to deal with those being introduced.
But while paternity leave is now a day one right, or from 6th of April it will be, that's not the same for statutory paternity pay, is it?
Yeah, that hasn't changed. So we've still got the qualifying period for that, which I think is 6 months.
Moving on, collective redundancy protective award.
Oh well, that's a bit more exciting. Well, it is if you're a lawyer and you think about litigation, which I do tend to. So the protective award, which is a very odd remedy in unfair dismissal, dates back to the 70s, and that's the award that you get if your employer has failed to consult representatives over a collective redundancy situation. And it's important because it's a punitive award. We don't normally get punitive damages in employment law, but you are awarded a sum of money in compensation, which at the moment is capped at 90 days pay, that reflect your employer's failure to consult rather than any loss that you've suffered. So if you get made redundant, the employer doesn't consult, they should have done because there was a 20 employee threshold, then you're entitled to a protective award for that. The tribunal's starting point will be to award 90 days pay if the employer has failed to consult at all, and will reduce that to the extent to which the employer did try to consult. Now that 90 days is increasing to 180 days. And I think this is a situation, you've got to think back to the P&O case that we had, where it was felt that employers were basically baking in the price of not consulting. They were prepared to pay the 90 days pay that they would have to pay if they just failed to consult representatives about large-scale redundancies. And it was felt that should be a more expensive thing to decide to do. So that's going from 90 days to 180 days. And I think that really should make employers look very carefully at the consultations they do when they're collective redundancy. Okay.
And there's also changes to whistleblowing laws around sexual harassment.
Yes. I mean, so what happens there is an allegation of sexual harassment will be deemed to be a public interest disclosure and therefore covered by whistleblowing law. I'm not entirely sure I can put my finger on the practical impact that actually has. I think in most cases, an allegation of sexual harassment would almost certainly be a public interest disclosure anyway. I suppose it saves you some disagreement with it. But of course, whistleblowing protection protects you from being dismissed. It protects you from being subjected to a detriment. You're already protected from being dismissed for raising a sexual harassment complaint and protected from a detriment. I think the only difference is that the remedy can be slightly different in a whistleblowing claim, that you can actually apply for interim relief. Whereas if you're in the process of being dismissed and you think that's because of a public interest disclosure, the tribunal can step in before that happens and award interim relief until the case can actually be tried. But it's a very rare thing to actually get, and I don't think this change is going to make very much difference.
And trade union recognition, this is changing, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, bless the government. They say they're simplifying the trade union recognition scheme. They're not, you know. I mean, try working through what changes are being made. They're not a simplification. They are addressing a number of genuine issues. And again, this is something that comes out of some high-profile cases that we've seen in recent years. Amazon, I think, had quite a high-profile case where they managed to see off a trade union recognition claim in circumstances that the trade union they weren't playing fairly. There were things about the manipulation of the bargaining unit and how many employees were brought into the bargaining unit after the trade union had done its recruitment. So a number of changes are being made to try and address that. But I don't think, unless you are an employer facing a statutory recognition claim, it's something that you're going to be having to deal with on a day-to-day basis. The whole statutory recognition scheme is incredibly complicated, and it's meant to be. It's meant to be so complicated that both parties throw their hands up in frustration and say, "Oh, let's just do a deal on our own." It's meant to encourage the parties to just encourage their own way of dealing with union recognition.
So to do it voluntarily rather than...
Yeah, it's very much the whole scheme of the statutory recognition process that at every stage, the employers and the unions are supposed to be taking stock and saying, look, can we just do our own deal rather than put ourselves through this complex process? The process is not being simplified, it's being made more complicated, but I don't think it'll cause employers too many problems.
Perfect. Okay. And finally, we've got a new watchdog.
Yes, the Fair Work Agency. Hand on heart, as the bill was going through Parliament, I largely ignored the provisions on the Fair Work Agency because I just thought there was plenty of other substantive things to take a look at, and I didn't pay very close attention to it. Here's a fun fact. I might have an odd definition of what a fun fact is, but see if you agree to me. The Employment Rights Act makes absolutely no mention whatsoever of a Fair Work Agency. The phrase isn't used. That's because the Fair Work Agency is not going to be a statutory body. It's what's called an executive agency. What the Employment Rights Act does is it gives powers to the Secretary of State over the enforcement of various aspects of employment law, and various powers to appoint inspectors and to have a board of advisors and to take action in respect of individual tribunal claims and potentially enforce them and provide support for people bringing employment tribunal claims. All of those powers are given to the Secretary of State. The government has decided that what the Secretary of State will do is set up a Fair Work Agency as an executive agency that will operate with its own budget, but under some political direction. So it's not an independent statutory body like ACAS or the Equality Commission. It's something that's very much part of government. And what's going to happen from April, when that gets formally set up as an executive agency, it will take over the functions of enforcement that are currently dealt with in terms of minimum wage by teams within HMRC, in terms of employment agencies by teams that are currently located in the Department for Business, and the Gangmasters Licensing Authority, which is to do with outsourcing workers in the agricultural sector. And they are a statutory body, and they're being abolished by the Employment Rights Act, and they're all being brought together into one executive agency. And they'll also take on the power to enforce two things that I think could be important: the statutory sick pay. They will have the power to enforce that, and also annual holiday entitlement. They'll have the power to enforce it. And when we say enforce, that means they get the same powers that they currently have for enforcing the minimum wage, which leads you to things like penalty notices and things like that.
And naming and shaming, like they do with the minimum wage, are they going to start doing that with sick pay? and holiday pay?
Yeah, I think theoretically they certainly could. Whether they do or not, I think, and this is the big question, and this is one of the reasons I largely ignored the Fair Work Agency as it was going through Parliament. Is it all depends on budget, doesn't it? I mean, it's all very well having this body created, and in theory, it can all do all sorts of whizzo things. But until I see the job adverts go out for 1,000 new labour inspectors, I'm not going to be convinced that it's going to do anything very much that's new. And I certainly think that once it gets set up, it's going to spend the first goodness knows how many months just figuring out how it integrates all its functions that are already existing within the current team. So I'm not expecting any dramatic developments from the Fair Work Agency over the course of this year. Over time, it may become a significant player, but that depends entirely on the government giving it the budget to actually do things. And I think the danger is it will sit there and it will theoretically have these powers, but realistically, it's not going to be very proactive, I think, in actually enforcing them.
But the agency is being chaired by Matthew Taylor, who, of course, authored the Taylor Review into fair employment practices. Do you think he'll have much clout?
I mean, I think it's a good appointment. I think he's a significant figure, and as you say, he produced the Good Work Report, which I think was quite an impressive diagnosis, really, of all the various things that are wrong with the way employment law was operating. And he must have been a bit disappointed with the extent to which government actually implemented the recommendations. They did implement some, but not that many of them. So he's well experienced in this area, and he knows how to work with ministers and all of that sort of thing. But it still comes down to how many boots on the ground can he actually call upon to enforce things like employers not paying sick pay or employers not paying holiday. And one of the dangers, and we see this with the enforcement of minimum wage, is you end up going for the low-hanging fruit, which is employers who are good employers trying their best, who are keeping very good records, but have got something technically wrong. So you see people named and shamed because they've, the way in which they've timed their benefits in kind, or people buying equipment and uniforms means that they dipped below the minimum wage for a large number of employees for a period of time. But not by much, but over a large number of employees, that's quite a large recovery that the employer makes. And we get a list of recognizable names. What we've really got to tackle with failures to comply with employment law are employers who are operating almost entirely in the grey economy, where they're simply not complying with the law at all, and we don't know where they are, and they're not keeping adequate records. They're not even, if you wanted to enforce statutory sick pay, you'd find no records at all of who's been off sick and who got paid and who didn't. And that's hard work to enforce, right? Going into those employers, those difficult, uncooperative employers who haven't got a payroll system who will hand everything over to you. That's a much harder thing to enforce. And I think it would be really good if we had an agency that could do some work in that area, but we'll have to wait and see.
Okay, more from Darren next month, I'm sure, on some of the other things that are coming down the line, but I don't think there's much until October 2023.
I think October is big. The thing to watch out for October, in particular, is third-party harassment. I think that's a very big deal. So let's talk about that next time, because I think that's really interesting.
All right, thank you, Darren. Adam, over to you now. I gather you've been looking at the rise of claims in the Employment Tribunal around neurodiversity and how HR and employers can manage this.
Yeah, that's right, Rob. Yesterday, we ran a story at Personnel Today originated with ACAS. They issued some new guidance on training managers to support people with ADHD in the workplace. But I think when we talk about ADHD and neurodiversity, there's a lot of blurring of categories. I don't think we can just separate autism, ADHD. It's a lot of related conditions, dyspraxia, but there's certainly been a huge rise in diagnosis, obviously, in the last 20 years. And obviously this filters through into the workplace, into how we train people managers to cope with it. And what ACAS found was that 35% said that their employer was ineffective at training managers to support neurodiversity at work. And that may sound not that high, actually, 35% ineffective. But the trouble is that none of the others knew how effective their employer was or was able to judge. So it reflects a kind of a real lack of understanding, I think, of neurodiversity at work. And Sheila Atwood, who is the HR insights and data expert at Brightline, she said that although demand for neurodiversity support has increased, with more than 7 in 10 organisations reporting a rise in requests, many employers still lack formal frameworks. Just 5% have a standalone neurodiversity policy, but 42% have plans to introduce one. And then she goes on to cite the challenges that limit progress, being insufficient time and staff resources, low awareness and understanding of neurodiversity, and limited budgets. Now, this is having a big impact in the workplace. So Charlie Mayfield wants to maximise the workforce, and it's a shocking figure that so many people with neurodiversity are not in the workforce. I think it's something like 50% at least are not actually in the workforce. But as a result of increased diagnosis, we're also seeing big increases in employment tribunals linked to neurodivergent conditions. In fact, they have actually doubled almost since 2020, according to the HM Courts and Tribunal Service. Yeah, they recorded in 2020 265 tribunal cases involving neurodivergent conditions. By 2025, it had increased to 517 cases, a 95% rise.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very much the tip of the iceberg. If you look at the actual statistics of decisions, you get quite small numbers, but that will be, behind those decisions are many more cases that don't get as far as a decision, but are cases where neurodiversity is in issue, and those cases may settle, they may get withdrawn. Those databases are not always completely reliable in terms of capturing all of the issues.
Anecdotally, Darren, are you talking to employers more about this than you used to?
Yes, absolutely. It's absolutely massive. It is probably the biggest new issue that has come to in front of employers in the past 5 to 10 years. It has become something that if I'm talking to HR people for a day, they will always want to talk about this. They will always have a new case that they're dealing with where they're trying to figure out what to do. And I think one of the problems is that, we can come up with a word like neurodiversity, but what that's actually encompassing is such a wide range of phenomenon that it's incredibly difficult to fit it within the relatively limited legal framework that we've got.
Yeah, and people talk about, we need to do more to support people with neurodiverse issues at work, but what forms can that take? The reasonable adjustments. What reasonable adjustments? There's a huge range of them. They can be giving somebody a private office. I've seen cases involving Tourette's syndrome, where people are given a private office to speak to. But if there's any stress and deadlines coming up, that person is given the opportunity not to speak to the rest of the team. So they're in a private room, a separate room. That's a reasonable adjustment in an extreme case.
It could be. I mean, I see a lot of employers providing noise cancelling headphones. Right. That's very much a thing. There's a real challenge here for employers. Being old enough to remember when disability discrimination first came into the law, I remember that we were talking then about reasonable adjustments that were all about access to a physical workplace, right? Yeah. We were talking about ramps and how wide the corridors were and things like that. We never get employers worrying about that sort of thing now. And what's difficult about making adjustment for neurodiversity issues is you're adjusting what you're asking of the employee in terms of the work that they're doing and how they interact with other people. So it's not just about coming up with a piece of equipment that helps them do their job. It's about asking their colleagues to interact with them in a way that is appropriate, or to basically absorb some of the potential challenges that are presented when someone is neurodiverse in the way in which they relate to other people.
Yeah,
and that can be a difficult ask.
Yeah, oh, very much so, and that's reflected, I think, in the case. In if you look at the actual some of the cases, you look at any of the cases that have come to light, how nuanced the judgments have to be.
Yeah.
When is someone unfairly dismissed who has ADHD? When are they fairly dismissed? You look at the cases. I mean, I think there was one involving a lad who works as a garage mechanic, and he was fairly dismissed after reacting badly to pranks in the workplace, and he threatened people. But it was the result of his condition, and I think that was accepted. But it felt that the threats went on a bit too long. He made a bit too much of it, apparently.
Yeah. So this is the challenge, right? So
yeah,
if what you have is behaviour that is arising from the disability, so it's behaviour that is to some extent prompted by the neurodiverse condition that the person happens to have, and you treat them less favourably because of that, that's, on the face of it, potentially discrimination, right? That's Section 15, unfavourable treatment because of something arising in consequence of a disability. There is a justification defence, so the employer can show that what they did was a proportionate means of achieving a legitimate aim. And I can certainly see that, you might accept that someone might struggle with deadlines. You might accept that you need to be careful about how you communicate with someone from management, for example. But you don't need to accept that someone has to put up with threats occasionally. I don't think a tribunal would feel comfortable saying that that's something an employer needs to adjust for or put up with. But these can be very difficult cases to judge.
They're very difficult. And in that particular case, the young lad involved, apologised profusely for his behaviour.
Yeah.
But he was still dismissed fairly in the eyes of the judge. There was a woman. There's also performance issues. A woman with an ADHD diagnosis partially succeeded in her claim against Capgemini last year on the basis of a failure to make reasonable adjustments. But when you look into the case, they had made a lot of adjustments. There was a lot, there were a load of allowances made, but not quite right. They weren't done quite correctly. And she was given too many tasks, and she was given too many deadlines. And the judge said that multitasking caused the claimant, as someone with ADHD, a substantial disadvantage. We accept her evidence that deadlines posed a difficulty for her. So these are very cute, nuanced judgments that people are being asked to make. And so you can imagine the difficulties for managers, who are managing people with these conditions, and to what extent how much leeway they give people. But they're facing pressure to employ talented people who have neurodiverse conditions. It's quite, we really do have to change our attitudes at work and our degree of tolerance, perhaps. What do you think?
Well, I think it's really difficult because it varies so much with the kind of work that you're doing, right? And it also, on the one hand, there is a positive to take from people with neurodiversity. They may well have additional skills that they can offer. There may well be qualities that they bring to the workplace that are incredibly valuable in the right role. But there are challenges as well. And, if you have someone who struggles with deadlines, there are some jobs where an employee can be expected to just deal with that. And there are some jobs where, frankly, being able to cope with deadlines is a really important part of the job. And if what you can't cope with is deadlines, Rob's an editor. I think he probably needs to be quite good on deadlines. Yeah. But not, there are some jobs where you can tolerate a certain leeway on that, and there are some jobs where you can't. And it's very difficult for employers to know whether what they can insist on and the point at which they can say, look, we can cope with this and we can help you with this, but here's the red line. You need to be able to perform at this level. And if you can't, then the job isn't for you. And that's a really, really difficult choice for an employer to make. It's incredibly difficult to draw a general principle from it. So when people ask me, they'll present a situation to me and say, well, could that be a reasonable adjustment or would that be discrimination? My answer is nearly always, well, potentially, yes. It sort of depends, really. And that's not the helpful advice they're looking for, but it's very difficult to know. There's an extent to which an employer has to make their own decision about what they can accommodate and what they can't, and be prepared to defend that if necessary. But there's no way of getting a sense check from anybody as to whether they've gone far enough without being sued and seeing what the tribunal says.
Okay, thank you, Adam. Thank you, Darren. Thank you, Joe. Okay, that is all we have time for. Remember to subscribe to the podcast wherever you get your podcasts. And if you're interested in taking part and want to share something with us, do drop me a line by emailing rob.moss@personneltoday.com. Our next episode will drop on the last Wednesday of April. The Personnel Today HR podcast is brought to you by Deal, hire, manage and pay anyone, anywhere. Thanks for joining us and goodbye.
See you. Bye-bye.
Cheers, Rob. Thank you.